Good day to all. This is Red Hawk. I'm here with Marianne, and I appreciate y'all joining us, suffering along with us through this show, because that's what this show's about. This podcast, we're going to try to go right to the heart of so much of the pain of life, and it's suffering. Is there a difference between pain and suffering? Are they the same thing? How do we really talk about suffering in the truest thing? And how do we begin to approach it in such a way that we can experience the suffering and the pain and not have it define us, not have it make us who we are? You know, there's a whole field called woundology, and people become their wounds, and they use them kind of as a currency. But that's not what suffering is about. As a matter of fact, that's part of the run from suffering that actually compounds suffering and makes more of what it is. So how do we sort this out? Well, welcome to the deep end. So, Marianne, how you doing today?
I'm suffering right along with you.
Yeah.
I love that line.
We're going to just throw all the religions out right out front so we can get all those different interpretations down, because, suffering has become a little bit something different to each religion, and those religions become kind of the mythic context in which we define our suffering. So I want to just kind of lay out how all that works a little bit. And we're going to refer back to some of these through the show, possibly. I think that now, but my notes rarely define the podcast. You know, the Hindus see suffering as a consequence of a previous life, those virtues or, despicables, and the weighing out of all those. And then you get reborn through the cycle of samsara, of, rebirth. And over. So that's pretty cool. If you're inside of it, it's pretty cool, and it's an interpretation.
Well, it depends on what you were born into, whether it's pretty cool or not.
Yeah. And maybe what you want to be born into.
Right.
In Buddhism, life is suffering. And we're going to go more into Buddhism as the show goes on, because it's a pretty important interpretation, and it aligns pretty much with a lot of psychological and spiritual models that run through the mystics of all these traditions. The next one is Christianity. Christianity is really interesting, and I'm going to just quote from a James Hollis book called Tracking the Gods. And he basically says, simply put, the purpose of the cycle of blood and sacrifice, death and rebirth, and that's what Christianity is about, is to enable us to participate in the suffering of the elected one, and through that suffering to be lifted out of the random horrors of life into a mythological, appropriated plane of mystery and meaning. Now, I will say that's the very best use of the Jesus metaphor, because suffering, the cross is right there within Catholicism. It's the point of everything, and all meaning comes from suffering within this context. And regrettably, I don't think the best of what Christianity or this model is what happens. But that's a whole other show. Go to the show on institutions, I believe. The Jews, if you really want to get a good look of suffering, they also would say meaning comes from suffering, and they offer two really wonderful expressions of that in the Hebrew Scriptures to me. One is Job, and there's a couple of endings to Job's, different endings, but it's basically how a righteous man gets the absolute, crap beat out of him in every way. He loses everything. And then in the revised ending, he's really dancing on a pile of dung after he's lost everything, because his relationship with God has been refound. And the other one is in Isaiah. And Isaiah happens when the people are in exile, and they're suffering the loss of not just family people that died in that transition, but also their land. Because up till that point, God was seen to be in the land. So they lost their God. And Isaiah, of course, redefines that. In Islam, suffering is God's will, and the whole thing is to endure. We hear in so many people in fundamentalism, God will only give you as much as you can take. That's actually an Islamic sensibility. Allah will only give you that which you can endure. Isn't that interesting?
Well, and there wouldn't be any mental hospitals if that were the case.
Yeah.
That's just my take on that.
There you go. So, and I've talked in this show that for me, suffering is about putting an end to it. That's the point of it to me. And that gets into whole concepts of compassion, and that comes from the root passio, which means the capacity to share the suffering of others. Now, I've just laid a background for us, but I want us to lay out Mary Ann and I's life a little bit because I want to bring suffering up close, and I also want to bring up close those impediments that our culture offers us, or not offers us, but imprisons us with to keep us from authentic suffering and keeps us bound to this inauthentic loop in my mind, and we're going to get to that. For me, I've experienced the loss of my parents, of course. I've had my own, back stuff and back surgery that went bad, and I mean, really painful stuff. I would say through all that pain, I suffered 2 days. The rest was just pain. And it was helpful for me to draw that distinction in those 12 days in and out of the hospital. And then, of course, I lost my brother, and he took his own life, which made the grief double. And he was what I would call a beautiful mind. When we went into his home, there was no bed in any bedroom. Every bedroom was set up with experiments and whiteboards and schematics and all kinds of stuff. So, and I'm dealing with my own family of origin stuff, which is just sucks because I think everybody's family of origin stuff probably sucks.
Well, I think we all have those stories from our childhood.
Yeah. And Mary Ann, for those of you who followed us, Mary Ann and I came together from the radio show. She had lost 2 of her 3 kids and her husband to cancer, which to me is still unimaginable, and even me saying that makes me quiver in my soul, if I may say that honestly. And so suffering is all about us. I think Buddha nailed it when he said, life is suffering. There's no way out.
Right.
So, Mary Ann, you've been through what I would call, one time you said you felt like the universe has bitch slapped you a number of times. And I just think about that moment. And how do you see the whole suffering thing?
Well, it's been quite a long process. And sometimes I have resisted very strongly, especially now, to be completely identified with the things that have happened in my life. And yet they are a big part of my identity because they were so earth-shattering, mind-shattering, soul-shattering. And when I look back on the progression, my daughter was diagnosed originally at 16 months old. She was my first child. I was pregnant with my second at the time. And to me, that the world ended. I did not know children got cancer. This was back in 1986. And my whole world just completely shifted. We got through it. We moved on. I had 2 more children. And then, we're going along, and 3 years later, my husband was diagnosed with cancer. And so it was kind of, it was mind-blowing. A year into his treatment, my daughter was diagnosed with another cancer. And so it was just this ongoing thing that just kept happening. And every time we found some equilibrium, we were thrown back into it. And I think that one of the things that you just mentioned about being in the hospital, that you were in pain, but you weren't suffering. And I think that part of that is the same thing. We were dealing with very painful emotions, very painful situations, but the suffering came later. The suffering came when you try to make sense of it and you try to put it in perspective. And at the time, I was very, very much connected. I believed that, all the religions kind of fell apart for me because they just weren't big enough to really handle the big questions that I was dealing with.
What a great way of saying that. They weren't big enough to handle
They weren't. They weren't. The platitudes were just like... And so I fashioned a new way to be in the world. And then 3 years after my husband and my daughter died, my son was diagnosed with a brain cancer, and all of that fell apart. And that's when I really kind of went to the chaos and nothing's connected and lost a lot of that.
And that's the whole losing your faith piece comes in.
Right. And then it's been a long journey back. And part of that came from the deep end because there were bigger questions that were not being answered inside of traditional religious teachings. And yet, all of it is there. All of it is there. But you have to, I really believe that we have to go on that solitary journey inside and find that place.
Yes.
Where the religious experiences that Jesus had or that Buddha had, they had the experience, and then they tried to tell us about that experience and show us the way to get there. But I think that we have to have our own experience in order to really get it. Otherwise, it's just on the outside, and it's I don't know, suffering.
Well, and they say that suffering and loss are literally the roots of all meaning. And if you go back to the Judaic-Christian beginning of the garden, if you will, and we've talked about that moment as a metaphor of the moment of self-awareness. We became aware of life and death. Oh my God, I'm going to die. Animals, they got instincts and they run the instincts till it stops. We don't.
So if we're going to die, what's the point of all this?
That's the point of all. And they also ate off the other tree, which was the tree of good and evil. And that gets into what makes you die is bad and what makes you live is good. And so the world started getting sliced up. And there's a point where the whole Cain and Abel thing is where evil enters in. Within that story. And that's where the first murder happens. What is it that divides us? And I want to say that, and again, I go to James Hollis, and I'll be honest, you want to get a handle on your life, man, go to James Hollis, but you're going to have to do some studying. Email me with what you want to do in your life, and you can do that at redhawkthedeepend at gmail.com, and I'll tell you which one of Hollis's books will nail where you are, because he's got one for everything. And he's got one right here because he talks about suffering is relative, contextual, and very, very personal. The great suffering, he says, of the dispossessed, we see those ads on TV, and, it takes a whole lot of something for those of us who live a privileged lives to somehow go about the banality of our lives when we know all of that is going on, all that suffering that is so deep. And what happens is we don't create little advertisements. He calls these divertisements. In other words, they're little things we run in our head that keep us away from the suffering of the world. And basically what it does is it estranges us from the deeper encounter of our own journeys. And what Mary Ann just talked about was how suffering and loss in her life didn't define her, but deepened her to see that her life was a journey. And, that's where we came together, and that's why we're still in this conversation, because it's a mystery journey, man.
Well, it is, and it's a very deep, deep journey. And what you were just talking about there, it made me think of, I've been thinking a lot about that quote from the Bible about it's easier for a rich man, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than a rich man to get into heaven.
Yeah.
And follow me on this, but it's kind of like replace rich with privileged. And you know, when you are poor or you're suffering, it's so much easier for you to be able to take that deep inner journey. When you are privileged and you can turn away from that suffering. You know, Elie Wiesel was one of the books I went to, Man's Search for Meaning. One of the things that he says is the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And when we become indifferent to the suffering of the world and we become, you know, immune to it, it's because we haven't taken our own journey through suffering. You know, the whole idea of Christ on the cross, it's not about him being on the cross, it's about him getting off the cross.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, I don't know, there's so many layers to this that...
Well, and the thing about it is, even as we're talking about it, another layer is being laid down right now.
Right.
You know, the whole concept about authentic suffering to me is what the deep end is about. Hey, we're all going to be it's all going to be painful. We're all going to suffer. There's no way out of it. Yet, when we try to opt out of suffering, what we do is fall into another deeper, more pervasive suffering. And so...
When you fear suffering, you're already suffering because of the fear.
That's right. You're in another order of suffering.
Right.
And you're also more out of touch with the original suffering that gave rise to the original fear.
That could open up your soul to your life's journey.
And, you know, what we end up doing is running from honest suffering, but we can't escape the pain of living this superficial life. And therefore, we mess up not just ourselves, but the world, because we end up trying to get the world to compensate. And if you don't believe that, just read the newspaper. I mean, what the newspaper is literally a trek of the human spirit through space and time and what's happening, what's going on. It's a little, you know, behind a boat there's this wake. Well, if you want to see the wake of the spirit of our times, just read the newspaper. It's a wonderful thing. But what happens is, and it's happening right now, and there's this erosion, this great obstinacy, this compensatory arrogance where we're all trying to compensate for something, and it creates this hysteria, and it literally makes our spiritual goods shoddy. You know, and if you don't believe that, look at what the evangelicals are. An evangelical dogmatic minister just gave prayers at the new embassy in Jerusalem, and he is known to say all Jews are going to hell, as well as Mormons, Catholics, and Muslims. And yet he just was chosen to open the prayers. But what this creates, we are creating these great, great occasions for suffering. William Sloane Coffin one time said to me, you think God's going to let us get away with this? He was seeing the stuff that's going on now that's happening really out loud. He was seeing it back in the 80s and 90s.
Well, and the whole idea that we're creating this, we're creating our own suffering. You know, one of the big laments is, why would God allow this to happen? And we're doing it. We are creating it.
Yeah.
Well,
we are the world.
I think, wasn't there a song about that?
Oh, it was so nice. It kept us really superficial, didn't it? And all thinking we were joining in something. And this is the work of our time. This is the work of every time. But right now, it's happening out loud, and we can participate in this spiritual happening. Because here's the thing. Whoever suffers their own personal journey more honestly, those people serve the world more greatly than those who serve any ideology, materialism, fundamentalism, or nihilism. And I say that with the deepest part of my heart. And it's all about how do we suffer this world more authentically. And now we're into Buddha again, because his whole philosophy, theology, it's not a theology, but it's a spirituology, is...
A what?
Spirituology. Did I just make a word up?
I like it.
Is how to connect us to our suffering. And not just connect us, but how to open us. You know, Rinpoche one time said that all of our sufferings do not belong to us. If you just broke your arm, that's not just your arm that broke. Every single arm that's been broken in all of human history, you're participating in that suffering. And you know, the word in Buddhism for suffering is dukkha, I believe. And it, all suffering, you know, what does Buddha say? All sorrow is joyful sorrow, and all joy is sorrowful joy. You can't get away, even in your deepest joy, you can't get away from a sorrow that's there.
I can completely relate to that. And being able to recognize those two simultaneously, that they are inherent in each other, is... Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's
where life touches the road.
It does.
And this is the place where all of suffering happens, where all of it is. And this is where we end up having to go back to compassion and empathy, because those are the fundamental pieces of the human being that allow us to share with each other. And I'll be honest, on Facebook, I still pray, and when people put their suffering on Facebook, I offer a small prayer. I know, you know, the best I can do is show that. I mean, is be that. And I don't usually do I like or I'm sorry. I just do it in my heart, because I'm just not a pious person, maybe. Now, on the other front, I see a whole lot of people, and I use this in my opening. I use the term woundology. And if you go to Carolyn Myss, how do you say her name?
Mace.
Carolyn Myss, in the Anatomy of Spirituality, she goes into the chakras, and she says, you know, when we open the fourth chakra of the heart, the negative aspect of that is as we started sharing all these pains with each other, because they didn't really do that before our time. You know, our parents didn't share all that stuff with each other.
No, that was all kept quiet.
That was all their stuff. But we're sharing that. I even, I'm on a podcast talking about family of origin stuff. Oh my gosh, that's so personal. I don't know where I was going with this.
The chakra, the heart.
Oh yeah, the heart chakra. What happened was the negative aspect is what she calls woundology. We ended up using our wounds as a currency. And this is what hurts. When I see people who've experienced loss and they chase their own butt in that loss instead of growing from it. And there's never what I would call a sublimation, where the loss creates greater depth of soul. It's almost like the pain of that wound keeps them in the same place.
But
do you understand? Am I making sense?
I do understand that, and I've been there. And I when you're in that, when you're hurting so bad, you can't see outside of your own, especially if it's so intense. I remember somebody telling me once that I beat them over the head with my pain. And I was like, what are you talking about? And part of it was that I could not relate to something in their life that was their washing machine overflowed. And I was like, please give me a break. And, you know, and and so I think when you're stuck in that, you know, there's post-traumatic stress, but there's also post-traumatic growth. And to be able to move from one to the other, it takes a lot of internal work. It doesn't just happen. And I see it I'm involved with a lot of online bereavement groups. And you can see where people can feed off of each other and, be so angry and mad and feel justified because they are hurting so bad. And then you get this group that comes in and says, oh, you're so right. Keep going. You're right. You're right. You're right. Rather than trying to, that's why I really like the face-to-face much better.
Yeah.
But there is a piece of that, and it takes a long time to I don't know, to step out of it. It doesn't just happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's a point where you have to wake up and say, enough of this. And that doesn't mean the seething cauldron of one's own mind slows down, that one's grief, when what I've learned as a pastor is when someone experiences loss, your heart breaks 10,000 times. The next day it breaks 9,999. It'll never stop breaking.
Right, I still grieve.
Exactly.
Right.
But how do you use that to grow more instead of grow less? And I think our culture does not help. We create these impediments to growth by keeping us stuck in these mental processes. And I think you said it almost says you're righteous in your pain.
Right.
But by not moving out of it, you create more suffering.
Well, I think what happens is you become myopic, and it's like you said about, it's not just your pain. Other people have experienced pain as well. And you start to think that you're the only one that feels this way. And it can be self-perpetuating.
Yeah. Well,
and I can't, I've been there.
And the one I people say you can't understand what I'm feeling. Well, I can't understand literally what you're feeling, Marianne, but I know there are people who can, and I know you've hooked up with them. Marianne worked with the childhood cancer organizations for decades, maybe.
For a long time.
Or a long time. And of course, you gather around people who can share that aspect of yourself where it's not an alien being, where, to tell your story is not to make someone else's story, for them to feel less in their own story.
Right.
But and that's important. But it's also important to let the whole world in. And the sharing of our suffering is a two-way street. And, compassion is an opening that is very anxiety-inducing.
Well, and I think part of that is that opening is how do we end the indifference that people feel towards suffering, and not just loss, but starving children, war. I mean, all of these things that we're doing, and if we don't have the stories of human beings, people that are affected and what they're going through, then we are going to be indifferent. We're going to let it continue. We're going to think that that's the way the world is.
While dozens were being killed at Gaza Strip, Jared Kushner was titching those protesters. And that's us. That's our voice. And if your heart's not breaking from that, then probably, some empathy is lacking. But if your heart's not breaking from that, you're probably not listening to this podcast anyway. So, Marianne, suffering, and how to suffer authentically. I mean, I'm getting old, and there are all kinds of little pains and stuff that are happening, and my wife says, "How you doing?" And I look at her, and I'm just trying to say, there's a new normal in town. And the pain need not be suffering. And a real anecdote to that, and it's a very harsh one, is humor.
Yes.
I mean, we're sitting here giggling with each other, but
talking about suffering.
And talking about suffering. And now we're seeing the whole concept of meaning and how that happens. So before we talk about our next podcast, any final comments about suffering and loss, Marianne?
No, but I think we need to go to the meaning piece, and maybe at some later date.
At some later date, we will go to meaning. As a matter of fact, it's
the
really
meaning in suffering. I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
And to be honest, I don't think there's any meaning without suffering. At least in the human family, I think that's what pushed us over the edge. And we're going to talk about that more. But before we get to the depth of meaning, I want to talk a little bit about something else. Let's talk a little bit more about this suffering. You see, what is it that suffers? You know, one of the posits that the Buddha talked about was life is suffering, but to what end? In the service of what or who? We've talked about the point of things. We've gone so many different directions. Do you believe it? We're getting ready to do our 42nd podcast. But how do we address the totality of who we are? The totality of your human being. And I'm talking about your blood, your brain, your viscera, your history, your spirit, your soul. I'm talking about including the spirit of our time and the history of all time. How do we talk about that? Well, you know, the word that Carl Jung talked about was psyche. Psyche. We are psyche. He said the psyche is a boiling cauldron of contradictory impulses, inhibitions, and affects, and for many people the conflict between them is so insupportable that they can't even wish for anything but deliverance preached by theologians. Titch, titch, too bad, when there's so much more waiting. God's peace, and we hope you'll join us for Psyche and the Nature of Meaning.